In this video, I'm going to be covering the various different shift controls that we have on the pads on the Machine Mark III controller. These are essentially modifiers that give us shortcuts to control various different parts of our sequencer and software. These can really help a lot with workflow and make sequencing a lot easier. You could think of them almost like the key commands in your digital audio workstation. Once you've learned them and commit them to muscle memory, it'll greatly speed up your workflow and make it a lot easier to quickly edit MIDI sequences. The first row of shift functions controls the pitch of your pattern. These functions make composing melodic sequences a lot easier. So in the sequencer, I have a quick melody that I have loaded up that I just pre-recorded, which sounds like this. And then we're going to be using these modifiers to adjust our settings. So let's select the last note in this pattern. And then I'll show you how all of this works. So the first two controls that we have are the semitone minus and the semitone plus. We can adjust the semitone of our note. So I can press that down and move it down 3 semitones or move it up 3 semitones. The next control, the octave control, will move your sound up or down an octave. So just hold shift and press down an octave and you'll see that it shifted our note down an octave. Or we could even move our note up as well. So this makes adjusting melodic sequences a lot quicker because you don't have to go in and fiddle around with this knob. Instead, you can just quickly shift things with these octave and semitone controls. So it gives you a lot more fine-tune over how you're controlling everything. Now we can move on to the next row of shift functions, which control various different copy and paste settings of the sequencer. So let's say, for example, we wanted to copy over this last note and put in an extra note step at the end of our sequence. We could hit shift and copy to copy the selected note, and then hit shift paste. And you'll see that it has pasted our new note sequence. And we could just move that around to something like this. We could even shift it up an octave as well. And then that gives us a new note in our sequence that sounds like this. You'll see that it's also extended the length of our pattern as well, so we can just go in and adjust that real quick. Just shorten that note up and then go to our pattern and change the length back to 2. So this enables us to create new notes in our patterns without having to go in and sequence a note with our step sequencer. So this really comes in handy whenever you're working more complicated patterns. It would be a bit more challenging to enter in new notes on the step sequencer if you're dealing with finer values. Now the copy-paste setting is also defined by your note grid. Make sure to go over to step, and we can just change that to 1 bar. Go back to our sequencer, hit copy and paste. And you'll see that instead of just pasting the note directly after this note, it pushes it all the way over to the end of our bar, because that's how our snap is set up. So for now, I can just hit shift undo a few times. And then we can actually go back and change our snap feature back. So the next two controls that we have here are the clear function and the clear auto. So let's say that we created a new note, but we didn't like the way that it sounded. We can select whichever note we want, and then we can hit shift clear, and it will delete that note from our sequence. This also works for any note in our sequence as well, so I can just hit shift and clear, and it will remove that note from our sequence. The clear auto button functions the same way, except that it removes any automation that we've created in our note sequencer. So if I write in any automation, and I just want to clear that automation, I can just hit this button, and it will clear that automation that we've recorded. So that covers the shift functions on the second row of pads. But as you may have noticed that our sequence that we've been working with, the top line melody that sits on top of everything, this kind of upper melodic section, is slightly out of time with our project because I originally recorded it in live. It's a bit easier to see this down in the main software sequencer. So if you look at the beginning of the note, you'll see that it's slightly off. You can see that in these sections right here. The notes are slightly out of time. Some of them are before the beat and some of them are after. And to automatically fix this, we could just hit shift and then the quantize control on the third row of buttons. And this will automatically snap all of our notes into time. So move over to the events control, go to the select control, go to the select settings, hit all. So that selects all the notes down in the sequencer, and then just hit shift and quantize. So now if we look at our notes down in the sequencer, you'll see that everything is now in time and properly lined up with our project. Well, let's say, for example, that we liked the overall feel of our entire project, but we wanted to keep things slightly more in time. Now we can just hit shift undo, get everything back to its default state. And then by pressing shift quantize to 50%, a machine will quantize the clip, but only by an amount of 50%. This will retain some of the original feel of our recording, but it'll make things a little bit more in time. So if we move over to our note sequencer, I could just deselect everything. We move over and look at our note sequencer. Some of our sequence is a bit more in time than it was previously, but it's not exactly on the downbeat. And this is a little bit easier to see down in the main software sequencer as well. The next two controls on this menu are the nudge controls, the nudge backwards and nudge forwards. These are used to shift the selected note back and forth in time. So for now, we can switch back over to our step mode, select our last note in our sequence, and then we can hit shift and nudge. We can pull it forward in time or pull it backwards in time. And this is also defined by the grid value that we have set down in the step sequencer. So you can adjust that from this menu. So if you want something a bit finer, you could do something like 64th or 32nd notes. Or if you wanted to move things by larger increments, you could set it to one of these values. This shift function also works in the events menu as well. So we can select all of our notes at the same time, hit shift and nudge, push everything forward, or push everything backwards in time. So this function just makes it a lot easier to move things around in the sequencer. So you don't have to worry about using this encoder to adjust where your notes are. The last row of functions we have is the various different undo and redo modes. And I've been using these throughout the course so far, but what these functions allow you to do is to either undo an action that you've created or redo that same action. So let's say, for example, I moved my notes over and I didn't like the way that that sounded. I could hit shift and then undo. I could hit it several times to get back to where we were initially, or I can hit shift redo to redo that action. So step undo and step redo are similar to these previous functions, except that they're used to specifically edit the steps of each sequence. So to show how this works, let's go over to our hi-hat pattern that we have. Let's go over to the drum set that we have. There's just a simple hi-hat loaded up onto this. And record a short hi-hat pattern on top of our chords that we have. So nothing too complicated. We could just hit shift and quantize. So now our pattern is quantized. Move over to the step view. And then if I was to use the normal undo control that we have, the shift undo, and first it's going to undo that quantize that we have set. But if I was to just hit shift undo, it removes our entire note sequence. But what these controls allow you to do is to undo each of those notes individually. So if I hit shift step undo, it removes just that last step that we have recorded in. And if I was to hit step undo one more time, it's going to remove the second note. If I hit shift redo, it'll just do the same actions, but in reverse. So this makes recording in sequences a lot easier. So say, for example, you recorded a lead line, but you didn't like the last two notes that you had. You could just use these step undo features to remove just those last two notes, all from the pads. So that finishes up this section on shift controls. Like I said in the introduction, these functions are definitely something that you want to take some time to commit to muscle memory so that you can use them without having to really think about it. This will help you speed up your workflow a lot and will make it a lot easier to compose MIDI sequences quickly in Machine. That way you don't have to mess around with various different submenus to get to the controls that you want in order to edit your patterns. You can actually do a lot of various different rhythmic and melodic sequencing edits all from these pads and the shift controls that they have. So that's all for this video. Join me in the next video where we'll be taking an in-depth look at sequencing automation on the Machine Mark III controller. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next video.